Hi, my name is Brian Maynard. I'm a professor of plant sciences at the University of Rhode Island, and I'm here today to talk to you about methods of identifying wildflowers and related plants using Newcomb's Wildflower Guide and Go Botany for the Home Horticulture Certificate course. So welcome, and I look forward to meeting more of you, either out in the field or during our question and answer period. So I'm going to share the screen for the talk now. And it might just take a minute to get this set up. So this is an introduction, as I call it, an introduction to random access keys, which I'll explain in a minute, and using Newcomb's Wildflower Guide and Go Botany to key plants. So I think we should start by talking about why we care about identifying plants. Identifying plants is important because as we move through the world as botanists or as horticulturists or gardeners, it's really important to know the plants that we're working with. You've taken other courses in this series on plant pathology or plant pest control, and you understand the importance of knowing the plants that you're working with. As budding experts in this field, you're also going to get lots of questions from people about how to care for plants, and often that involves knowing what kind of plant they're working with. And as we discuss plants with other people, it's really important that we understand the identity of the plant, the scientific name, etc. So how do we identify plants? We identify them often by just going out in the field with our field guides and identifying what's in bloom. But for larger studies and more in-depth studies of plants, we often have to deal with plant collections, including plants that have been pressed, for example, in herbaria, or answering, as I mentioned before, queries that come over the phone about plants or emails that we receive where people send pictures. The time of year is really important because often plant identification, as you'll see, involves seeing particular parts of a plant, like the flowers or the fruit or the leaves. So we have to be able to look at these plants at a time of year when those parts are available. So identifying plants may involve going back several times during the year to find plants in different stages of growth. So in keying plants, there's basically two kinds of keys that are used. And what is a key? A key is a written set of choices that you make in narrowing plants down to the species that are what you see in front of you. Dichotomous keys are forking keys, and you have one of two choices at each step along the way. For example, as you see here, we may have a key for animals, and the first question we ask are whether they have feathers or not. And if they do, that narrows it down to ducks and hens. And then we ask the question of whether they swim or not. And if they swim, it's a duck. And if they don't, it's a hen. And if they don't have feathers, then the next question that we ask is whether they have legs or not. And if they have legs, they're a lizard. And if they don't, they're a snake. So this is a very simple example. Dichotomous keys, as you'll see if you look at them in more depth, either with some of the books I recommend or on the Go Botany website, which we'll look at later on, can be quite lengthy. And because of that, a lot of people don't want to use dichotomous keys, and they also don't really reflect the way that we deal with plants and think about plants in nature. Often you look at a plant and you notice several characters all at once. You notice that it's an herbaceous plant, for example. You notice the flower color, you notice the shape of the leaf. You may not be able to see the fruit all at the same time. And keys that take this into account are called character or random access keys. And character or random access keys, which are the ones that we'll be learning how to use today, will look at all sorts of things, pretty much all at once, sort of like a matrix of things like flower type, whether the flower is regular or irregular, flower color, leaf type, simple and compound, leaf arrangement, opposite and alternate is often the first step in many woody plant keys, and is important for all keys. Leaf margin type, whether it's smooth, toothed, or divided, and fruit type as well. All of these things can contribute to a very quick narrowing down of all the possible plants to the ones that we're interested in. So as we look at the main thing that I hope you'll gain out of this is that there are a lot of field guides out there, some of those which are more useful than others. And so that brings up the question of what makes a good key. And a good key is one that works for you. And often this means one that you've spent the time to get familiar with, but it also means a key that if you make a mistake, will still get you to the right plant. And of the books and the field guides that I'll recommend later on, for the most part, these are all ones that allow you to make a mistake or two without getting totally frustrated and getting you either to the actual plant identification or close. As you learn how to identify plants and work on identifying plants, it's really important to, first of all, verify the identifications that you come up with. You may use a set of characters and a key, whether it's dichotomous or random access, and think that you have the correct ID, but you need to verify that. And one good way that I'll recommend is to go to the GoBotany website and type in the name of the plant that you think it is, and then look at their pictures and their descriptions and see if it matches up with what you have. You can also verify by talking to other people that know plants better than you do. You can just search it on the web and look for pictures or other information. But it's really important to verify that the plant that you think you're looking at is actually what it is. And it helps you learn the plant better if you go through this extra step. And then it's also important to have a record of what you've identified so that as you identify plants over and over again, you'll be able to refer back to the characters that helped you identify those plants more easily. Now, in plant identification, there's a lot of excitement, and it's justified for some of the identification apps that are available for use on your cell phone. Things like Seek and iNaturalist and LeafSnap and things like that. Some of these apps work really well most of the time. But as you will see, some of these apps don't work as well when you don't have all of the characters there. For example, taking a photograph of a plant that doesn't have flowers on it could give you a very different result than taking a photograph of a plant in flower or in fruit. And again, it's really important to verify the identities that these apps tell you without just assuming that the apps are 100% correct. And that often means knowing how to use a key or knowing how to use a field guide as part of that verification process. So hopefully you'll gain today not only appreciation for Newcomb's Wildflower Guide, which I'll introduce in a minute, and GoBotany, but you'll also gain an appreciation for how technical and how important it is to be correct in identifying plants. So Newcomb's Wildflower Guide, and it's shown here with the blue cover, but it's also available with the yellow cover, as you see here, was originally published in 1977. And it is still, I would argue, the best wildflower guide for New England. In that time, since 1977, with the genomics revolution and the DNA revolution, we're now able to identify plants with much more accuracy with those methods. Not that that's a method that you would use in the field, but as a result, many of the family and genera names have changed over that time. So about 30% of the names in Newcomb's are now outdated, but it is still the best key for the Northeastern US, as we'll see, because of how well it's laid out and how easy it is to use. Because of the names that have changed, and luckily it's mostly herbaceous plant names that have changed, and the tree guides and the fern guides are still pretty accurate. But because of all the name changes, there is some people have gone through the effort of creating a botanical name update for Newcomb's, and that's available at the link that you see here. And I believe it'll also be made available on the Brightspace page by the Home Horticulture Certificate folks. So what does Newcomb's not cover? Well, Newcomb's doesn't cover trees for the most part, unless they have a lot of flowers, and that's a common trait. It doesn't cover ferns, it doesn't cover mosses, it doesn't cover grasses or sedges or rushes. So it is a wildflower guide. Later on in this talk, I'll recommend other guides that you would want to consider getting for your library if you want to have more extensive coverage of the plants that you might encounter out in the wild. So what special skills do you need to use Newcombs? Well, one of the great things about Newcombs is that it's written in a way that you don't need to have a lot of special knowledge. But in the book, there are excellent pictorial guides to different botanical terms on the back, in the back of the book, and also in the frontispiece of the book. You can see these photos here and the drawings. There's a glossary in the book that has definitions of different terms. This is all on the first few pages of the book, so it's really worth reading those pages to expand your botanical vocabulary. But for the most part, Newcombs assumes that you don't know a lot about the naming of different plant parts and things like that. So really, the only special skill you need with this guide is one that you can achieve, which is practice. So as we come into spring and summer, I'd urge you to get a copy of Newcombs. And after we've gone through this part of your home horticulture certificate program, get out there and start identifying plants on your own and verifying them, and you'll gain confidence very quickly, I'm sure. So as we name plants, many names will end up being expressed in Latin. And the reason for that is that Latin names don't change, and they hold across different languages because Latin is a archaic language, and common names can vary in different languages and even in different regions of the same country. So when we talk about plant classification and using the proper names for plants, it helps a little bit just to review the way that plants are organized and why it's important to us. So if you were naming a plant, you would at some point realize that every plant and every living thing on Earth can be organized in terms of relationships into kingdoms, like the plant kingdom and the animal kingdom and the bacteria kingdom and all those things. And then within those kingdoms, there's divisions, things like flowering plants, the angiosperms, and the conifers, the gymnosperms. And then there's classes and orders, which are other divisions that bring us down to the ones that we typically consider in horticulture and home landscaping, which are the family, which is a grouping of similar genera. For example, the maple family has maples and nowadays includes horse chestnuts as well. And that's the Sapindaceae. And then the genus, which is a group of one or more related species. So if we were talking about maples, that would be the genus Acer, which includes red maple, sugar maple, Norway maple, etc. Many different maples, all of which have similar characteristics, but are not the same species, of course. And then the species, which is supposed to be a unit of classification in which the different species can't interbreed, though plants violate this rule all the time because we have hybrids. But species is considered the basic unit of plant classification. So when you identify a plant in Newcombs or any of the other field guides or on GoBotany, your goal is to get down to the species level and to also keep track of the genus that you're working in and the family. And we'll look at an example of this coming up. Horticulturally, we often go down to a lower level, even below species, of the varieties, subspecies, cultivars, etc. These are things that we care about botanically or horticulturally because it differentiates observable differences within a species. For example, different flowers, different variegation or leaf characteristics. But as far as identifying plants using field guides, they don't go down to this level typically. They stop at the species level. Occasionally, GoBotany will talk about different subspecies that naturally exist or occur in our range, but those aren't ones that you're typically going to worry about. So when you write the names, it's important to write them properly to recognize that scientific names are in Latin. And For that reason, the genus should always be capitalized. The first letter should always be capitalized. And the species should be all lowercase unless it's a proper name. And the genus and species together should be underlined or italicized to indicate that it's a Latin word. And then the cultivar, if we're using that, can either be the cultivar with the name or name in single quotes. So the examples below show some different ways, proper ways of writing plant names. For example, Acer saccharum, the sugar maple. Acer saccharum is underlined. Acer is first letter capitalized, saccharum is lowercase. Sugar maple is the common name, typically not capitalized unless it's a proper name. And then Sapondaceae, which is the family, is not underlined, even though it's a Latin word, but that's just the way it is. And the first letter is capitalized. You could also, for example, italicize the genus and species, as we see on the next line for Pinus coreensis, the Korean pine. And notice Korean is capitalized because it's a proper name. And then Pinaceae. And then there's an example at the bottom line of writing properly writing the cultivar name if you're using that in your communications. So this is different ways of naming plants and organizing them into different taxonomic categories, classifications that we can use to keep track of what we're identifying. So as you start to learn how to use Newcomb's Wildflower Guide, I'd urge you to start at page 1 and start reading through. And it talks about how to use the guide. It has a glossary of terms. And by the time you get to Roman numeral page 10, which is where we're going to start today, which is the key system and how it works, you should be familiar with the structure of the book and how it's laid out. And with any field guide, it's really important to go through these steps rather than just diving in, because that will save you a lot of grief if you get lost, because you'll at least know where to go to get help or how to get organized. So Newcomb's keying system is based on 5 questions, and those questions are outlined on page 10, Roman numeral 10, the key system and how it works. And the 5 questions are, 2 of the questions relate to the flower type. The first of the flower type questions is the flower regular or irregular? And what that means is, does the flower have a circular arrangement of petals going around so that the flower can be divided in a number of different ways to have a mirror image? Or is the flower irregular, which means that it can only be divided one way to create a mirror image? And if you think of things like pansies and irises, those are irregular flowers. Or are the flower parts indistinguishable? And what that means is that they're either so reduced or small or complicated that you can't really tell the flowers apart. And an example of this would be a ragweed or mugwort. And you can look those up in the book. And actually, that brings me to the point, which is, if you find these terms confusing and unfamiliar, the best way to figure how these work is to go into the book and go to the sections with regular flowers and irregular flowers and indistinguishable flowers, and just flip through the pages looking at the pictures. And I think you'll get the idea pretty quickly of what those terms mean. And then the second question, if they are regular flowers, is how many petals or similar parts do they have? The picture we have here on the right shows a flower with 6 petals. So that would be a 6-petaled flower. But you could also have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, and sometimes even 7 or more, which typically refers to composite flowers like asters and sunflowers and things of that, daisies and things like that, that have separate disc and ray flowers. Again, page through the book at the different sections for different petal numbers, and you'll see the kind of the patterns that they're referring to. So the second set of questions is with the plant type. So once we've looked at the flowers, and so question 3 is the plant a wildflower or a shrub or a tree? So a wildflower technically is an herbaceous perennial or an annual. It grows each year during the growing season, and then coming the next fall, the above ground parts die, or if it's an annual, the entire plant dies. And if it's a shrub or tree, then the woody parts of the shrub or tree exist from year to year. It's a perennial, a woody perennial. So the question is it a wildflower, herbaceous, or is it a shrub or a tree, woody? And then the fourth question is, if it is a wildflower, does it have leaves or not? Or if it does have leaves, are they basal, meaning only at the bottom of a naked stem with flowers on it? And you could think of like a tulip, for example, would be an example of this. Or are they alternate? Do they alternate up the stem, which means that there's a single leaf at each node on the stem? Or do they have opposite or whorled leaves, which means that there are two or more leaves at each node on the stem? And then the last question is, if it has leaves, are the leaves entire, which means that the edges are smooth without any teeth? Or are they toothed or lobed? Or are they divided, which means that if they're divided, it'd be like a rose flower, or a rose leaf rather, where it has leaflets, and each leaf is divided to the center. So thinking about this, what are the limitations of this system with this 5-question system? Well, I think the main limitation is that you need both flowers and leaves present in order to use the keys. And so if it's a plant that has leaves for only part of its annual life cycle, then you'd need to make sure you were there to collect the leaves or take pictures of the leaves when they're there. And there are plants you can imagine, ephemerals, spring ephemerals, for example, where the leaves do fade away pretty quickly in the spring. And obviously this wouldn't work in the winter. And also it has to have flowers in order for you to see the flowers. So both of these things mean that you may need to encounter the plant at certain times of the year or go back to the same plant again and again until you have all of the clues answered, or as many of them as possible. Though I'll hasten to say that if you are not able to answer all these questions immediately, you do have a choice, which is to leave that question unanswered and just go through the book and look at all the different sections, ignoring that one question. For example, if you knew that it had 5 flower parts, but you didn't have the leaves to look at, you could just go through the entire 5-parted flower section from beginning to end, including plants that have no leaves, leaves that are basal, alternate, opposite, etc., just to look at all the pictures and try to match up for an identification, which you would then verify, right, after that, since you're missing part of the plant. So let's do an example here. This shows all the flower types. There's 8 major divisions of flower type in the book. There's the plant types. There's divisions within the flower type of 6 different kinds in most cases, as you see here. And then within leaf type, there's 4 different possibilities. So let's look at this example. So we have this plant that somebody has sent us a picture of. And I'll provide some more clues, but this is a shrub that grows in wet areas, typically swamps or marshy areas. And it blooms in the mid-summer and produces fruit in the late summer. So looking at the flower type, you would look at the flower, and in this case, the flower is regular because it has a circular arrangement of petals, and it can be divided in a number of different ways to give you an identical mirror image on either side. And in this case, if you count the petals, you'll see that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 petals. So this would be a flower with 5 regular parts. So let's underline that. And the way Newcomb's works is that by answering these questions, you create a 3-number code. And so the first number here would be the number 5. Next, the question becomes, what is the plant type? And here we have a shrub, as I told you. So it's a woody perennial with multiple branches. And if you didn't have enough of the plant to look at, you would need to either go ask the question of whoever gave you this picture, or you'd have to go find it for yourself. but this is a shrub, so we'll underline shrub, and our second number here then is also 5. And then the third question is, if it has leaves, which it does, what kind of type are the leaves? And in this case, the leaves are divided. So remember back to introductory botany, the definition of a leaf is a green flat structure that's attached to a stem at a node. So the node is here on the stem, and so this entire thing is a leaf. These are each leaflets. So this leaf has 7 leaflets, but the entire leaf is the collection of all these leaflets attached to this petiole and then attached to this stem at a node. So in this case, the leaves are divided. So this is underline number 4. So our code for this plant is 554. So now to use the Newcomb's keys, you would turn to page 1 in the book, which is not a numbered page, but it's the beginning of the numbered pages. And that's called the locator key. So you can see right here, it says locator key on that page. And then you would, scanning down the group numbers on the left side of the page, you would go along until you find 554. And that is going to be 2/3 of the way down the page, or 3/4 of the way down the page on page 9. So what I always tell my students in field botany and other courses is that when you get to this stage, you should always confirm the characters that got you to this page. And Newcomb's is nice in that they have all the characters listed on the page here, as you can see right there. So you can start at the top, and it says flowers with 5 regular parts, correct? Shrubs, and notice it says continued, and that means that there were shrubs on the previous page. But remember, the shrubs that we're looking for are on this page. And then it has down below, you see it under 554, it says leaves divided. So the characters that got us to this page are repeated here, and we can confirm that just to make sure we're not getting lost. So then the next question under 554 is the question. There are more questions, and they are indicated by the indentation of the questions. So equal indentations represent now basically multiple choices that we make, typically 2, but they can be 3 or even 4 choices that we make to get to a finer definition or identification of the plant. So in this case, the first question is indented equally flowers 1/2 inch or more wide, or flowers under 1/2 inch wide. And then notice underneath that it has leaflets 3 or leaflets 5 or more, stems not prickly, and stems prickly. So all those are different possibilities. But in our case, our flowers are greater than 1/2 inch or more wide. And you might say, how do you know that? Well, I know that because I know this plant, but also if this wasn't indicated in the plant that was submitted, or if we can't see that on the plant we're looking at, then of course we'd probably have to go through all the plants between page 316 and 322. But in this case, the person that sent us this picture, me, is telling you that the flowers are 1/2 inch or more wide. Now, a nice thing about Newcomb's, along with other good field guides, is that it has rulers on the edge of the page right here. So you actually have a ruler with you all the time when you have the book with you. So feel free to use the ruler. So knowing that we have all these characters and flowers that are 1/2 inch or more wide, then we know to go to page 316 of the book. So going to page 316, paging through, it's a nice thing in Newcomb's. They have wonderful line drawings. And one of the great things about Newcomb's with the line drawings is that it shows different plant parts that you wouldn't necessarily all find at the same time, like you might see flowers and fruit together, as you do on this page. And not all the pages are in color, but some are, and they're really lovely drawings. So that's one of the benefits of Newcomb's. So looking on page 316, the next step would be to look at the drawings and find ones that look close to what we're what we see in the picture we have here, or the picture that we took, and also to read the description. Well, as I mentioned before, our plant is a shrub, and here we call it a bushy shrub, and it has upper branches that are smooth except for scattered thorns, and it grows in wet soils. And it has dull green leaves and hooked prickles and narrow stipules. So if you combine looking at the pictures with reading the descriptions, you'll see that if you go partway down the page, it says bushy shrubs without long arching flowering stems. Those would be the brambles. And then upper branches smooth except for scattered thorns. And then looking at the choices below those, which are swamp rose, pasture rose, Virginia rose, and smooth rose, if you read the descriptions, you'll see only one of these grows in wet soils. And it does mention that the leaflets are dull green and that the prickles are stout and usually hooked. And incidentally, if you really got into identifying our native roses, another thing you would worry about or think about would be the stipules, which are the leaves at the base of the petiole of the little appendages at the base of the petiole of the leaf. And in the case of swamp rose, which we have here, they're very narrow, and it talks about this in the description of the plant. So what we're looking at is swamp rose, Rosa palustris, and that's a lovely plant. I hope you've had a chance to see it, and I hope you'll identify it this summer using your Newcombs. So think back about how we got here, what we had to do, and the steps that we took. And let's try another one. So this plant is a common late summer perennial that is often found in moist soils. Doesn't have to be wet soils, but moist soils. It can tolerate shade to some extent. It has long strap-like leaves that are alternating on the stem. And I know these pictures aren't good enough to show you that, but this is pretty much what you would see. So you'd have to look at that when you're taking the picture to determine that the leaves are alternating on the stem. And if you look at this, you can see that the flowers have 3 parts on them, and that they are in a rotate or regular pattern. Even though they can't be divided, well, they can be divided several ways to give you mirror images if you go through the center of each one of these petals. So this is a regular flower with 3 parts. And you can see that it's an herbaceous plant because all you see is green. You don't see any woody parts. And if you look at the edge of the leaves, you can see that the leaves are entire. They have no teeth or lobes. So let's answer these questions. Again, going to Roman numeral page 10. Let's just pull that page up again and answer the questions. So first of all, what flower type do we have? Well, we have flowers with 3 regular parts. So that would be number 3 in our 3-letter code. Next, in terms of plant type, as we already said, we have a wildflower with alternate leaves. So that would be a second 3 for our 3-number code. And then if we go to leaf type, remember the leaves are entire, and so that would be a 2. So our plant would be the code 332. So go to page 1 of the book, the locator key here on page 1 of the book. Look in the left column and page down until you get to 332. And 332 is at the bottom of page 3 of the book. Confirm the characters that got you here. And notice that at the top of page 3, it's still in the irregular flowers section, but it's down the page that we go through flowers with 2 regular parts, which is a very short section, only page 116. And then we have flowers with 3 regular parts. And then under that, the first choice is wildflowers with basal leaves only, that's 322. And then wildflowers with alternate leaves, and that's 332. Now, something I'd urge you to get in the habit of when you're looking at the book right here is if you see something that's close to the bottom of the page, always flip pages to see if it happens to be continued. And what you'll see here is that it is continued onto page 4, but that is 333 leaves toothed or lobed, and then et cetera, leaves divided. So all of the 332's leaves entire with alternate leaves with leaves entire are all on page 3. So you want to know that just so you don't miss something by accident. So under 332 leaves entire, we have 2 choices: flowers large, 3/4 inch or more wide on page 120, and flowers small, under 1/2 inch wide. Now, in this case, if you didn't know the size of the flowers, it was just a picture that was sent to you, you could look at both pages pretty quickly, right? But in this case, the information is there. We measured it. The flowers are large, 3/4 or more inches wide. So that tells us to go to page 120 in the book. So paging to page 120. Again, look at the clues to make sure that we're in the right place. Look at the drawings and the descriptions. So we are looking here at plants that look very much, they don't look like irises, which are the majority of those drawings, right? It looks very much like a spiderwort. So looking at spiderworts at the top of the page, you can read about spiderworts, the genus Tradescanthia. Luckily, the name is not changed on this. And it talks about these having blue or purple flowers, talks about the flower width and broad petals, talks about the arrangement of the flowers and the leaves and where they occur. And so the next step would be to read the descriptions of both spiderwort, Tradescanthia, and notice they abbreviate the genus just to the letter T, Virginiana, or Ohio spiderwort. And looking at this, notice that the leaves are green and the sepals in the flowers stalks are hairy, and the leaves here are green, and also the leaves that subtend the flower are also green. And so we would decide, but have to confirm, of course, that what we are looking at is spiderwort Tradescanthia virginiana, which is a lovely late summer perennial that I hope you'll find and look for and key using Newcombs this summer. So we've done 2 plants. We've done a shrub and we've done an herbaceous plant. Both had regular flowers. So I would urge you to go out and find irregular flowers, et cetera, to expand your knowledge of how to use Newcombs. So what other guides do I like? I'm very picky when it comes to using books, but I've also put a lot of time into learning how to use these books. And so I'm kind of partial to them because I know how to use them. But these are ones that all have very positive traits to offer. Newcomb's Wildflower Guide, we already covered. Another one for trees and shrubs is a field guide to trees and shrubs of northeastern and north central of the United States. And this is by Petrides and Peterson. It's one of the Peterson Field Guide series. It was published in 1992, but not much has changed, and the names are pretty much almost all the same. So that's useful. It has really excellent keys in it, both for plants in leaf and also plants in bud without leaves. So it's a very useful book. It has excellent line drawings that show plants with a multiple of characters. And it also uses a multi-access random key, as we've learned with Newcombs. Another one is the Northeast Ferns. It's a field guide to ferns and fern relatives. This is a relatively new book, came out in 2013 by Stephen Chad. And this book has excellent drawings and an amazing amount of information about not only ferns, but also lycophytes and other fern relatives. And it's a wonderful resource to have. And it's a very, very inexpensive book. And so I'd highly recommend this. This book uses dichotomous keys. So it'd be a chance to learn how to use a forked key instead of a multi-access key as you learn how to identify ferns and fern relatives. The grasses, sedges, and rushes a lot of people consider those too difficult to even tackle, but there's a wonderful guide out there by Lauren Brown and Ted Elliman. They're both local. Lauren Brown is from Connecticut and Ted Elliman's from Massachusetts. And this came out in 2020, has wonderful pictures and very usable keys, very simple keys that are usable to help you identify these groups of plants. And then for the real professional botanists and taxonomists, The current guide that's used for New England is the Flora Nova Angliae, or the Flora of New England by Arthur Haynes, who's associated with the Native Plant Trust and Garden in the Woods. And this was published in 2011 and recently had a large update, which is available through the Go Botany website. So these are some of the books that I would have in my library just as a beginning library for plant identification. So what I'd like to introduce now is the Mystery Plant Challenge. The Mystery Plant Challenge is a monthly plant challenge, which is part of the Among Rhode Island Wildflowers website. So if you're in Rhode Island and you like wildflowers, this is a website that you should visit and explore in more depth. It's a wonderful website that has a lot of historical botanical information. It has plant lists for different parts of the state. And it has on it, and this is now a website that is hosted by the Rhode Island Wild Plant Society, which is a wonderful organization to belong to. And I happen to be running this website right now. So the Among Rhode Island Wildflowers website, on the front page of the website, has a mystery plant that starts on the first day of each month. And the goal is for you to go and use the pictures and the description of the plant to key this plant out, typically using Newcombs and sometimes using Go Botany. And then if you submit your guess on the bottom of that page that the mystery plant is on. And if you are correct, your name will be included on the website for an entire month in a list of people that successfully identified the previous mystery plant. So I call it engraving your name in gold. So if you'd like to have your name engraved in gold, I'd urge you to try the mystery plant game. So just as an introduction, these are pictures of the April mystery plant for April 2023. And this changes each month. But the April 2023 mystery plant is a perennial herb that's found locally in Rhode Island along lake and river shores and in wet meadows. It's a lovely little plant that grows during the summer. It's a herbaceous perennial. It has opposite leaves, which are simple, meaning that they're not compound or divided. They're entire, which means untoothed, and they are elliptical or oval. The plants have yellow flowers, which are 1/8 to 1/3 wide. They're borne singly or individually on elongated pedicels or little flower stems, and they have 5 separate petals and sepals, and they have 5 to 12 stamens, or the male parts of per flower. And the fruit is a capsule, and it measures 2 to 3.5 millimeters in length. So what I would urge you to do is to use what you've learned for Newcombs and try to key this plant out in Newcombs. It is in Newcombs, and also try to key this plant out in Go Botany. And you can find the Go Botany website at this web address. And it has on the site a simple key. It also has a full key and a dichotomous key, but the simple key is a good place to start. And you should be able to key this plant out using that. We'll go through this using the Go Botany website and using the simple key as an example during our live meeting, our Zoom meeting. And so if you have any questions about how this works or your experience with this, feel free to bring these questions to our in-person meeting. And then submit your guess, on the Among Rhode Island Wildflowers website, and see your name engraved in gold next month. So that's the end of this presentation. I hope that you will go identify some flowers, go out and grab some. And I'll just tell you right now, I would urge you to choose wild growing plants, not cultivated plants, because the cultivated plants are less likely to be in the wildflower guide because they're not really wildflowers after all. And try keying them out in Newcombs, and then start playing around with the Go Botany website just to learn the lay of the land, and we'll go into that in more detail later. Thanks for riding along with me, and if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to the home horticulture certificate staff or to me during our in-person session. Thank you very much.